So far, we have had 5 Michaels play across 6 seasons, and while we've had at least one close call, none of them have broken through. And admittedly, that streak would continue with Michael Snow, who played on the very next season on Survivor Caramoan, aka Fans vs Favorites 2. Similar to Mikey B, Michael Snow is placed on the Fans tribe, and he actually had a bit more success than Mikey B, where early on he aligned himself very closely with Matt Bischoff, as the two of them were essentially in the middle of the tribe, where on one hand you had sort of a Misfits alliance, but then you also had the Cool Kids alliance. And while Shamar greatly annoyed Michael along with the rest of the tribe, Michael and Matt decided to side with Shamar and the Outsiders during those early votes, and sure enough, that was the majority early on. And yes, while Shamar was medevaced not too long afterwards, that group still held the majority throughout the rest of the pre-swap, but then Michael got a very bad tribe swap where both he and Matt were placed on the new Bacall tribe, which was mostly favorites, and while he was effective in bonding with Corinne early on, he was still seen as a pretty big target due to his close bond with Matt Bischoff, and sure enough at that first tribal, the favorites do gang up on his closest ally Matt, which was pretty bad, and it seemed like Michael would be the next to go afterwards. But due to his bond with Corinne, they were effectively able to flip the votes against Julia, and sure enough at that next tribal, despite Michael seeming like a bigger player on paper, Corinne is effectively able to flip over Philip, allowing them to take out Julia instead. So on the whole, despite Michael getting a pretty bad swap, he was able to get through 2 tribals pretty alright. But then the merge came and his luck pretty much ran out, where Corinne went first and he was the next go thereafter. So on the whole, Michael Snow was a pretty effective player and was able to survive some pretty tough situations, but ultimately his luck did run out, which did cause his downfall here. It would be another 4 seasons before we had another Michael play again, this time coming in Survivor Worlds Apart, which was the blue collar versus white collar versus no collar season, and here we had Mike Callaway, an oil driller from Texas, who is a pretty solid pick for the blue collar tribe. Mike was an interesting figure, where despite him eating a scorpion on day 1 and being a bit of a doofus at point, he was seen as the leader of the blue collar tribe, and he was in the majority for most of that pre-merge, where he's a pretty critical swing vote during the Lindsay round. And following the swap, he even threw the challenge to save Kelly, the sole blue collar from the other tribe, and blindsided Joaquin in the process. And while he loses Kelly right at the merge, his group is able to hold the numbers for the next couple of rounds, and he was even able to find an idol along the way. But by the final 9, issues were starting to crop up. He discovers that Rodney, his fellow blue collar member, had built a secret alliance with Carolyn, Tyler, and Will, and were planning to blindside him next, prompting him to hold out for an advantage that would be offered at the next auction, which at that point had become a pretty standard strategy on Survivor. But before the advantage could come out, Jeff pulled out letters from home and offered each of the tribe a chance to get their letter from home for a low price of $20. The tribe agreed to collectively put in the $20 so that everyone would have the same amount of money for the advantage, which would then be decided by a rock draw. Mike, however, got cold feet, and he tried to discreetly get up and sit back down without actually buying his letter so that he could simply buy the advantage without having to go to a rock draw. However, he was quickly called out for this, and he backed down, agreeing to the rock draw, only to lose it to Dan, leaving Mike in the worst of both worlds. And he only made things worse when he decided to expose Rodney's alliance back at camp when everyone else was trying to enjoy their letters, making Mike the primary target from that point on in the game. And for most players, that would have been it. Mike would have lost the next challenge, been voted out, and been remembered as a player that blew up his own game. However, Mike is not like most other players. Mike won the next 2 immunity challenges in a row, sparing him from elimination. He did slip up at the final 7, however, due to the idol that he had found earlier, he was essentially safe for that round. And with him getting Sierra and Carolyn on his side, he was able to control the vote despite getting most of the votes against him, where he successfully played the idol and blindsided Tyler in a 3-0 vote. And from that point on, he was never vulnerable again as he won every immunity challenge thereafter, tying the record for most individual immunity wins at 5. But even beyond winning challenges, he was pretty active in the strategic game as well, building a final 3 deal with Carolyn and Will that allowed him to control a lot of the votes moving forward, where he was able to take out Dan at the final 6, Sierra at the final 5, and at the final 4 was able to get out Rodney, who was one of his biggest threats to winning the game. And with that, Mike got all the way to the end, being the second Michael to reach Final Tribal Council, but unlike Michael Scoopin, Mike Callaway was actually the favorite in this Final 3 scenario, where people were impressed by his streak of immunity wins and his navigation at the endgame, allowing him to win in a 6-1-1 vote. Mike Callaway was able to do what Michael Scoopin was not, and that is to win the game, breaking the long streak of Michaels that have come before him, only to come up short. Now granted, the fact that he needed to win out from the Final 9 is a pretty big knock to his game, and would cause him to be pretty low on my winner ranking. But even so, it was an impressive feat and a clear accomplishment of what Michaels could do on Survivor. And the crazy part is that he would not be the last Michael to do well either. The next Mike would come 5 seasons later on the aptly named Heroes vs. Healers vs. Hustlers, another occupation-themed season, but here we have Mike Zahalski, also known as Dr. Mike, who was placed on the Healers tribe. Dr. Mike struggled out of the gate, being caught looking for an idol on day 1, and he did seem to be on the bottom for a lot of the early game, although over time people were growing a bit uneasy by Joe Mena, though fortunately for Mike, he never actually had to go to tribal during the stage. After the swap, he seemed to be in a slightly better position where he did seem to be in the middle of the original healers, as well as the newcomers in Ben and Cole, and he also found an idol during this stage. Although, similar to his previous tribe, he never actually had to go to tribal. When Dr. Mike eventually went to tribal at the merge, he was in for a rude awakening as the former heroes and hustlers teamed up to take out the healers one at a time. Mike himself was spared from the onslaught due to his connections with Lauren and Ben. However, he even tried to idle out Ben at the final 10, only for that to be unsuccessful. But fortunately for Mike, he was able to survive until the final 9, at which point the majority line started to fracture when they decided to cut out one of their own in JP, and he benefited from Ben and Chrissy's target levels becoming bigger and bigger, but by the final 7, he was essentially a lone wolf. He had a bit of a notable moment during the final 7 tribal council when he threw Lauren Rimmer's idol into the fire after she had handed it to him. But even so, he was still on the bottom and saw as Lauren went out of final 7, and he did successfully vote out Ashley at the final 6, but by the final 5, he seemed pretty unlikely to win, as despite Ben being the biggest target left on the board, it seemed like Devin and Ryan were bigger jury threats compared to Dr. Mike. Even so, he was part of the majority group that was planning to target Ben, who had just played 2 idols in a row. But at that final 5 round, a third Ben bomb got dropped in a row, where Ben pulled out another idol, and it seemed that with the majority being unaware of this third idol, that Ben would have had the sole vote to vote out Devin at that round. However, in an interesting twist, Devin, anticipating another idol play, threw his vote onto Mike, resulting in a 1-1 tie between him and Devin. And with Ryan and Chrissy being much closer to Devin than they were to Dr. Mike, they voted out Mike on the revote, sending him out in 5th place. On the whole, Dr. Mike was a pretty fun character across the season, one of the more kooky characters, and a pretty notable underdogs during that season. Even so, Dr. Mike didn't really have much control in the game despite making it to the final 5, and came up relatively short despite making a deep run. We would only have to wait one more season to have our next Michael in Survivor Ghost Island, and here we have Michael Yerger. Now, sort of the opposite of Mike Barassi, Michael Yerger was actually the youngest player on the cast. And as a bit of a fun fact about myself, Michael Yerger is actually the first person younger than me to play Survivor, which I always found a bit interesting. Yerger found himself on the Malolo tribe, which was a fitting name considering how bad the tribe ended up being in challenges, and while the first round went alright where they were able to find a consensus target in Gonzalez, but by the second round, Michael found himself in quite a bit of danger when superfan Jacob Derwin decided to target Michael for being a physical threat. And considering Jacob is known for getting what he wants, particularly by manipulating Navidi into sending him to Ghost Island during the first round, Michael knew he was in a lot of danger and that he would need a lot to go his way in order to keep himself safe. Now, Jacob had told the rest of the tribe that he had gotten an idol through Ghost Island, which made Michael consider splitting the vote. However, thanks to Stephanie Johnson's work, she was able to suss out that Jacob was actually lying about having an idol. Even so, they decided to split the vote regardless, And considering that Jacob didn't actually have an idol, they were able to win the day, sending out Jacob Derwin in swift fashion. Unfortunately, the success was short-lived, as there was a tride swap immediately afterwards in which the Malolos were down the numbers on the new Malolo tribe. And while Michael and the others attempted to flip over some of the original Navidis, the Navidi contingent didn't seem willing to flip over. Michael would have to do some more work. He and Brendan were able to find an idol, but not just any idol, but one of the idols that James Clement had in his bag at the time he was blindsided at the Final 7 of Survivor China. Now, admittedly, this was just a regular, normal, hidden immunity idol that could only be played on one person. But as a longtime super fan and a student of the game, Michael sensed an opportunity here. He ran around the tribe telling them that because this was James's idol, that he could play it on 2 people instead of just 1 person. And the hope here was that he would ensure that both he and Brendan were safe, thus increasing their chances of potentially winning over the numbers here. However, at Tribal Council, the bluff didn't work. He went out to play the idol for Stephanie Johnson, and it was only then that he revealed that, sure enough, the idol could only be played on 1 person, but since no one really bought it, Brendan was taken out, costing Michael one of his allies. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they had to go to Tribal again the very next round, and this time Michael was talked about much more as a potential target due to his physical strength. However, Michael was able to save himself as an Navidi group threw their votes onto Stephanie Johnson instead. We then got another tride swap where Michael remained on the Malolo tribe, and this time he was still on the bottom alongside James Lim, and there was a chance that he could have been voted out. However, he was able to build a decent relationship with Angela from the original Navidi group, and at that first tribal they went to, they were able to blindside James Lim, which wasn't ideal, but it allowed Michael to stay another day. By this point, Michael was fed up with losing challenges and having to go to tribals. Figuring that the Malolo tribe and the color orange were the constants behind his perpetual losing, he decided to burn the tribe banner before the next challenge, hoping that it would give him some success. And sure enough, it did, as he was able to win the next immunity challenge, ensuring that he would at least have a break for 1 round. And sure enough, the next round was the merge. He had made it to a point in the game that many fans dreamed of making, and he even managed to find another idol. It seemed for the moment that things were turning around for Michael. But like so many other things, his success would be short-lived. In many ways, the post-merge felt like the pre-merge. The original Malolos were outnumbered 5-8, and while the first round was straightforward with Chris Noble and Dominic's rivalry coming to a head, culminating in Chris Noble being taken out, Michael quickly found himself on the outs, and he recognized that Dominic and Wendell were dominating the game. He was determined to cause a flip, to flip the game against these power players, and it would start with Angela, someone he had met during the post-swap. However, Angela had other ideas. Despite her not being much of a player herself, she thought this would be a great idea to stir the pot, this time by telling lies about Michael, to the point where the Navidis had their eyes squarely set on Michael. Things weren't looking good. Now, fortunately for Michael, he did have an idol that he was able to play successfully, negating 7 votes at the second tribal. However, the majority alliance had enough numbers to split the vote, sending Libby to the jury, and worst of all, no one else voted with him against Wendell. So far, nothing was going Michael's way. Now, he did get a bit of a break during the next round, where Desiree had a similar idea to him in trying to flip the game against Dominic and Wendell. However, once this plan blew up, Desiree became a pretty clear consensus target, and Michael was able to vote in the majority against her. However, the following round would be a split tribal, where the cast was divided into 2 tribes that would each go to tribal separately, and Michael got a really bad draw where he ended up on a tribe with Dominic, Wendell, and Laurel, who constituted a clear majority that had no interest in working with him moving forward, and he seemed to be the pretty clear target once he failed to win immunity. However, he did have one saving grace through Kellen, who had gotten an extra vote during her time on Ghost Island. Now, Michael did try to bluff that he had an idol, however this was pretty ineffective as neither Dominic nor Wendell believed it. However, with Kellen having an extra vote, there was a slight chance that Michael could get his way. If the 2 of them coordinate their votes and Wendell doesn't use his idol, there was a chance that Michael could take out a power player and put himself in a better position moving forward. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be, as Kellen ultimately used her extra votes in an effort to target Laurel instead, who she felt confident didn't have an idol, and with Michael voting for Wendell, this resulted in a 2-2 tie where Dominic and Wendell had the upper hand on the revote, and sure enough, Michael was taken out on the revote. On the whole, Michael Yerger very much had a rough time on Survivor, where he was very consistently an underdog through losing challenges and being down the numbers. He was definitely a capable player who had a lot of knowledge of the strategic game, and he was able to find plenty of idols and advantages and use them in creative ways. However, due to him being consistently down the numbers, he was very much out of control for so much of the game, and with the majority being unwilling to flip and being unwilling to turn against Dominic and Wendell, it just meant that Michael was very much doomed by the end of it. On the whole, Yerger was very capable, wise beyond his years even, but it just wasn't meant to be. Now, back in part 1, I mentioned that Mike Barassi was the final Mike to be taken out in the pre-merge as of Survivor 43. However, despite us having 3 Michaels left to talk about, Michael Yerger was the last Michael to be voted out at all. The final 3 Michaels we'll be talking about all got to the end of the game, and what we didn't know at the time was that we were about to enter a Michael renaissance. The very next season of Survivor was David vs. Goliath, a seemingly simple theme, but one that allowed for pretty dynamic casting, and for the Goliath tribe, they got none other than Mike White, who couldn't have been a more perfect pick for the Goliath tribe if you tried, as he had long been a screenwriter in Hollywood, being behind such classics as School of Rock and Nacho Libre, and he had also been on 2 seasons of The Amazing Race, so he had plenty of experience on reality TV. However, even before David vs. Goliath, Mike White had already had a pretty noticeable effect on Survivor itself. You see, Mike White was actually friends with Jeff Probst, and Probst seemed awfully willing to listen to Mike White when it came to production advice, with the most notable instance being in Samuel Del Sur, which was originally supposed to have Redemption Island on it, sort of similar to the original Blood vs. Water season, until Mike White talked Jeff out of it, which caused it to be replaced by the Hero Duels. So already Mike White was very much a giant both in Hollywood and even within Survivor. Now early on, Mike made a similar mistake to Dr. Mike in that he searched for an idol on day 1, which definitely put a target on his back. However, he was able to ingratiate himself pretty well to where he ended up in the majority, and at the only tribal they went to during the pre-swap, he was part of the group to take out Jeremy. He then got a pretty favorable swap where the Goliaths held a majority, but even then he was able to build a decent bond with Nick Wilson that allowed him to be in a pretty pivotal swing vote during both tribals that they went to during that stage of the game. And upon reaching the merge, despite him being a notable celebrity, he was in a very powerful position where on one hand the Goliaths had the majority that could allow them to control certain votes, but he also had decent bonds with a lot of the Davids, such as Nick Wilson, with Christian, with Davey even, that allowed him to also have other outs. Now that isn't to say there wasn't adversity along the way. He did get one up during the John Hennigan vote out, where the Davids were simply able to one up a lot of the Goliaths, and even during the Dan round, he was on the outs there where he tried to target Christian. But even so, Mike still has a lot of power within the game. At the final 9, he's able to build a final 4 deal with Nick, Angelina, and Davey that's able to hold the numbers for the next few rounds. They're able to take out Carl and Gabby in quick fashion. And even at the final 7, while Mike does try to flip the vote against Davey, they're able to get out Christian, who is a pretty big threat. And at the final 6, Mike is even able to get a 1-up over Nick by flipping the vote against Davey, who was one of his numbers. And through that, Mike is in a pretty strong position to get towards the end of the game, especially with Allison being a bigger threat than him. At the final 5, they're able to take out Allison, but at the final 4, Mike does get a bit unlucky with Nick winning final immunity, which does cause him to go into fire. However, considering Kara K was his opposition, he didn't have too much trouble beating her, and just like that, Mike was the 3rd Mike to reach Final Tribal, and coming into it, it seemed like there's going to be a battle between Mike and Nick, considering how very little people respected Angelina's game, and Mike White does a decent job propping up a social game and talking about how he grew over the course of the season. However, by the end, it almost felt like he didn't want to win the game, and he definitely took his foot off the gas, allowing Nick to come in and really make his case, thus allowing him to win in a 7-3 jury vote. And reading his exit interviews, you kinda got the sense that he felt bad considering that he was more well off than Nick or Angelina, and that he would have preferred one of them to get the money over him, despite debatably playing a better game between the two of them. But on the whole, Mike played a very impressive game where, despite him being a celebrity and despite him not coming off as someone that would be that invested in the game, he proved that he was more than just a big fan and more than just someone that smoozed with Jeff Probst. He was someone that could come in and walk the walk and prove that he was a very capable player. And even after Survivor, he has continued to have a very successful career, creating the White Lotus, which ultimately won him an Emmy. And he has continued to have an impact on Survivor as well through his friendship with Jeff Probst, where he was a critical reason why fire tokens were not brought back on Survivor 41, and who knows what else he could be behind in the future. So while Mike White failed to win Survivor, his impact on the show cannot be overstated. It would be 5 seasons before we get our next Michael on Survivor. By then, it was a new era. The show had changed forever, and on Survivor 42, we had Mike Turner, a retired firefighter from Hoboken, New Jersey. Mike was the oldest player on the cast, placed on the Vati tribe. Early on, Mike built a very strong bond with Jenny, which allowed him to be part of the duo structure on the tribe, although things got a bit more complicated once he found the Beware advantage, which took away his vote until all the other Beware advantages have been found. Although he found an interesting strategy after finding out from production that he didn't actually have to say the phrases at each challenge, thus allowing him to remain quiet until everyone else found their idols and said their phrases before he decided to speak up. Meanwhile, it seemed at first that he had Daniel on his side and would have stuck true to him at that first tribal, resulting in them taking out Lydia, who was part of the other duo. However, things got a bit more complicated when Chanel, Daniel's ally, went to Shipwheel Island and lost her vote after deciding to risk her vote for whatever reason, which resulted in a tie vote. Things only got worse when another tie caused the tribal to go into a deadlock. Now, unfortunately for Mike, Daniel's unwillingness to go to Rocks resulted in Jenny being taken out, and while that would be a bad thing as Mike would now be on the outs without his own ally, Daniel's nerves also caused him to blow up his own game, which in turn caused Mike to become a swing vote as Hai, now feeling betrayed by Daniel, who he thought was on his side, decided to recruit Mike to be part of his alliance. And thus, despite losing his ally at the first tribal, Mike was now in a swing vote position. And sure enough, after his Beware advantage was activated, Mike was able to vote out Daniel at the next tribal that they went to, allowing him to get to the merge in a pretty solid position. And that position was only bolstered when he built a very strong relationship with Jonathan, who he related to due to them both being seemingly tough guys on the outside, but really being softies on the inside. However, it was also during the stage of the game that Mike's flaws started to come out, namely with him being pretty emotional and him being willing to die on honor and loyalty, which really came out with him really wanting to target Chanel due to Chanel voting for him, despite the fact that he had also previously voted for Chanel. And while he was able to remain the majority for a lot of the post-merge, these flaws definitely started to harm his perception by a lot of the jury. And things didn't get much better at the final 6, where despite being approached to blindside Omer, who at that point was seen as the biggest player in the game, Jonathan and Mike didn't go along with this plan as they were worried that Lindsay could use her amulet, which at that point had become an idol, to save Omer. And while they were technically part of the vote split, the fact that Marianne and Romeo were able to cast most of the votes against Omer due to Romeo having an extra vote allowed them to claim most of the credit for that move. And then at the final 5, Mike decides to play his idol on Marianne, despite the fact that Marianne didn't get any votes against her, and also the fact that Marianne had her own idol in her pocket that she had withheld from most of the people in the game. And while he was able to beat Jonathan in the fire making challenge at the final 4, the moves that he made during the past 2 rounds really harmed his perception in the eyes of the jury. But despite his questionable jury management, Mike actually came into Final Tribal in a good spot, as a decent amount of the jury considered voting for him, as they recognized that he was in the majority for more of the game compared to Marianne. All he needed to do was deliver with a solid Final Tribal performance. Unfortunately, Mike struggled to own up to his game, and he didn't seem to realize a lot of the flaws that he had. he didn't seem to recognize the way in which he burned people like Chanel, how he didn't seem to take credit for a lot of the big moves that were happening in the endgame, which, considering that he himself didn't have many flashing moves to his name, was a big problem. And he was completely outclassed by Marianne, who delivered a great final trial performance, where she was able to claim credit for a lot of these big moves, how she was able to present herself as an underdog, and that she had a greater awareness of her game compared to Romeo and Mike. I think the one moment that sums up this final trial the best is when Marianne pulls out the idol that she had at the time of the final 5, when Mike decided to play his own idol on her, thinking that she didn't have any other form of protection, as it really showed to the jury that Marianne had more control of the game over Mike, which, despite the fact that Mike was in the majority for more of the game compared to Marianne, really wowed the jury to the point that the jury vote swung in Marianne's favor, resulting in Mike losing in a 7-1 jury vote, only getting Jonathan's support. On the whole, Mike was a very likable presence and someone that was willing to play the game at points, where despite him being the oldest player on the cast, and eventually being the oldest player to ever reach Final Tribal, he showed that he was willing to hang with a lot of these younger players and be willing to blindside people at certain points. However, it was his willingness to claim that he was playing with honor and integrity, despite the fact that he was very much playing the game, that caused a lot of players to lose respect for him by the end of it. And despite him debatably playing the better game between Marianne and Romeo, it's pretty clear why Mike ended up losing this game. So on the whole, Mike was a very likable player, but one that failed to win. And with that, we have one last Michael to talk about. Coming just one season later, on Survivor 43, we have Mike Gabler. Gabler was an interesting prospect coming into it. His audition tape coming into the season was very interesting, revealed a pretty wacky character, and on his preseason bio, when asked, "Why do you believe you can be the sole survivor?" his mere response was, "Yes." However, early on it seemed like he was on the outs, where he was a bit of a wacko on the Baka tribe. He did get an idol that allowed him to be safe through the first 2 tribals that he attended. However, there was a potential that he could be targeted, especially after he did not so great in the first challenge, to the point where he announced to the rest of the tribe that he was going to use his shot in the dark at the first tribal. Although this was an interesting move, as it did kind of get the target off his back, to where eventually Mariah was the target instead. However, the rest of the pre-merge was pretty bumpy from a physical, social, and strategic standpoint. Physically, he got pretty tired to the point where it looked like he was going to quit at some points. Socially, he got on people's nerves, like when he tried to put palm fronds over people while they were sleeping. And strategically, Ellie and Janine tried to target him at a point by trying to trick him into thinking that his idol was no longer valid, even though it clearly said that it was good through the first 2 tribals that he attended, as opposed to the first 2 tribals period, as they tried to say. Fortunately for Gabler, he never went back to tribal during the pre-merge, and he even picked up on what Ellie and Janine were doing to the point where he started targeting them. And it seemed like Sammy and Owen were willing to go along with him as they built this guys alliance. At the merge, Gabler's main mission was to target Ellie, and he was determined to do so by any means necessary. During the merge feast, he announced to everyone that was safe that he was going to target Ellie, even though Janine was right there at the table. But thanks to Ellie overplaying by trying to blatantly play both sides, everyone caught on to Ellie being the big threat that she was. And sure enough, Gabler got his way, sending out Ellie in the process. But Gabler knew that he needed to do more if he wanted to win the game. He determined that he was going to lay low for a while, relying on his social bonds to really connect well with people, and he was largely effective in doing so, being able to be a part of some pretty critical votes during the post-merge. Now, admittedly, he didn't really control much, as it seemed like Jesse and Cody were more in the driver's seats during a lot of that. Even so, Gabler really was able to build good favor with a lot of these players, to the point where he was able to build an alliance with Jesse and Cody in their Ride or Die alliance, but then later by the final 7 was able to build a final 3 deal with Cassidy and Owen. Gabler had not 1, but 2 viable paths to getting to the final 3, despite him coming off as a goofball to many people. However, Gabler also recognized that one of these paths was much more likely to lead to him winning compared to the other. He recognized that he could beat Cassidy and Owen if he got the chance to, and that he would need to cut Jesse and Cody along the way. And so, he did that. At the final 6, he was part of the Cody blindside. At the final 5, he was also part of the plan to take out Carla. And at the final 4, despite Cassidy being the one to win final immunity, Gabler was the one who got the chance to go into fire and beat Jesse, the biggest player in the game. And not only did he beat Jesse in the fire making challenge, he also broke the record for fastest completion of the fire making challenge at just 4 minutes and 9 seconds. Truly an impressive feat. But more importantly, he had gotten to his ideal final 3 of Cassidy and Owen, 2 people that he knew in his mind that he could beat. And the kicker? Neither Cassidy nor Owen knew this going into Final Tribal. They thought in their heads that the battle was between themselves and that Gabler was simply the GOAT. However, as they found out the hard way, the jury was very much in Gabler's favor. They felt like he was the one that made the biggest moves in a season in which the final 3 were not noted for making very big moves. And while Gabler could come off as a follower to some, they felt like he could claim the most credit for the Ellie move at the merge. And they felt like he could claim the most credit for taking out Jesse in the fire making challenge. And for them, that was enough. And Gabler knew that was enough. And you could tell just by the jury laughing at the things that he was saying that they were very much on his side. And to the complete shock of Cassidy, Owen, and about 95% of the viewer base, Gabler won in a 7-1 jury vote, just 1 vote away from having a perfect game. It was definitely a shocking moment to say the least. Even people that recognized that Gabler had the elements of a winning game, and a winning edit for that matter, few could actually see it coming. They felt like it just didn't make sense for Gabler to actually be the winner. It seemed like the only people that could even envision the idea of Gabler winning was the jury and Gabler himself. And admittedly, in hindsight, the pieces definitely fall into place. You can definitely see how people like a Cassidy or an Owen had a misread of their position in the game. And through that, Gabler emerged as the most logical option. He emerged as the most lucky winner. He seemed to be the most aware of his game, and he seemed the most intentional with what he was doing throughout the game. And really, that says a lot about a player. That explains how someone like a Mike Gabler could win Survivor. Needless to say, the history of Michaels on Survivor has been a bit of a roller coaster. I'm sure a lot of people didn't expect this to be as turbulent as it was, and yet, when you look at the individual people, it makes sense why it would turn out that way. Michael is such a common name that it embodies the entirety of the human experience, the good and the bad, the great and the cowardly, the light and the dark. Everywhere you look, you can find both of these extremes coexisting, and pretty much everything in between. But at the same time, Mikes actually do very well on Survivor, where on average, a Michael will last 27 days in the game, which is longer than an entire Survivor season nowadays. And on average, a Michael will make it to about 7th place. And when you factor in the fact that 5 Michaels have made it to Final Tribal, and 2 of them ended up winning their seasons, it really goes to show how impressive Michaels have done across Survivor history, despite there being so many times where a Michael could have been taken out early. Now at the end of the day, Michael is just a name. These 12 players that we talked about across these last 2 videos don't have too much in common outside their names, but similar to Kelly's, it's hard to think of a name that has had a greater impact on Survivor history than Michael. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video, or I guess pair of videos. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now again, I do want to make more general Survivor content like this moving forward, so stay tuned for that. I am also planning to cover Australian Survivor once that gets started, so stay tuned for that as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.